That poem of Vorehearing, which we just heard, does have dark black print on the translation because there's a lot of dialect in it. Some of that is just words for wildflowers, for elements of the natural world, which you would expect local dialect to have. But there are also words like mazady, which means difficult. What do you think the dialect is doing there? Are you trying to recover a language that a vitality in language that you think we've lost?
Well, obviously the Dorset dialect is very important to me growing up there, but also it's such a wonderful tool for writing poetry with, because dialectally having these different meanings, you've got to understand that in poetry you're not just dealing with the sense, you're dealing with the sound as well. So a word like mazady sounds complicated and tangled, and that's just the sense that the sound of those consonants and vowels give you. And so therefore you have these other meanings. So for instance, another one would be the word for the barley seed, which is spile. And I use the word spileful to refer to a barley seed, which sounds like spiteful. There's something nasty about it, which ties in well with the poem, which is actually about death. So the actual translation of mazady is knotty. So if you were to look in William Barnes's glossary, it's knotty. So, rather than, I don't have to say knotty month, it's a difficult month and described by something being tangled and knotted.
The subject matter here is mazady. It's difficult and knotted. This is not a prettified version of rural life. You have jerry cans and car batteries amongst the ash trees and snowdrops. And there's a sense of sexual violence and alcoholism too. Do you think that those darker sides of country life sometimes get airbrushed out by people who write about it?
I do feel that it can be presupposed that country life is beautiful and solely beautiful. And obviously there are many different levels to it, as there are in towns or wherever you go. There are many different levels, and there are often a lot of very dark things that happen in beautiful places throughout. So yes, I definitely wanted to show the whole spectrum of country life.
The other sense of shadow here comes from the folklore, which is woven throughout the entire poem. I mean, you have little details like farmers used to place prematurely born calves in the fork of a maiden ash, head pointing to the east, to prevent other cows from casting their calves. You have the idea that if you steal an egg from a robin's nest, you end up with crooked little fingers. They're very dark pieces of knowledge, those, aren't they? They present the world almost always as a threat and a danger.
I think most folklore does present very dark interpretations. They're almost warnings to scare us to not do those things, so they have to be quite dark. I think if you look at folklore from probably any county, it would be the same. So it's fascinating, and again, wonderful raw material for a poet.
And did you grow up with that folklore? And were you, as it were, like the young child here, did you go into the woods a lot as a child? Was that an important part of your growing up?
Yes, I did, yes. During my childhood, I would play outside most of the time, unless it was absolutely too cold, which wasn't very often. But we lived outside. I think particularly as country children, you do. And certainly you could very safely back in my childhood's time.
Yes, it's not entirely safe for Ira Abel here, who and she comes up, it seems to me, with psychological defences. She has a sense of this young lamb that has been killed, a pet lamb for her, and she's sort of converted it into a presiding god in the woods. But she also has this spiritual sense of encountering ghosts in the wood, ghosts that are protective to her. Not all of them, but some of them. Where did that come from?
I've always been fascinated with the childhood imagination, and I think but being lucky enough to have continued to be a creative artist all my life, I do feel that largely I'm drawing still from that same place, that the wide scope of a childhood imagination. And in that, it's often quite difficult to unravel what is real and what is not. And do you really have to separate them? As children, I think we probably don't. We largely live in that imaginative world, or certainly live in it as a parallel world with just as much reality to it as the real one. And so Ira Abel in this book, she lives in both these worlds, the real world and her imaginative world, and doesn't really draw a line between them. I do feel, again, like having this, being lucky enough to have the life I've led, where I can continue to explore my creative imagination to create works. I feel that I do live in those parallel worlds, really.
It's not I've said earlier, it's not a sanitized view of the country, and it's not a purist notion of folklore either. Interestingly, the ghost that Ira Abel encounters is partly constructed out of Elvis and Love Me Tender. Strains of pop music come into the poem all the way through. Is that because you think there's no distinction between, as it were, the folk ballad and a modern pop song?
I hadn't thought about that, and I hadn't thought of it being no distinction between them. But going back to what I was saying earlier about the collapsing of history and narrative stance and era, I liked the mixing up of all these different elements: the ancient, the modern, the futuristic, and that none were greater than any other. And I think also, going back to it being written from a child's point of view, I mean, I think that there's a lot of music that runs through childhood, from the nursery rhymes to the first pop song we might ever really become attached to. And it seemed natural to me that this 9-year-old would have a lot of song going on in her life.
I absolutely loved the rewriting of My Favourite Things that you've done here, which draws on one of those deep rhythms that get into you through popular music or through folk song. Gap mouth a scraping and ghost mouth a flapping, brushing my face with his thurial satin, numb in a zweemy dance on woozy wings. These are a few of my favourite things. It goes on with, I have to say, things that would never have been in a Rodgers and Hammerstein lyric.
Yes, I had enormous fun. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because the material is dark. There's the dark things happen in this. It's never, as I say, sanitized. But it's a playful work in many respects. Did you enjoy writing it?
I really enjoyed writing it, and I think one can't have dark without light, or light without dark. And I think it's really important to be able to have a laugh at some of these terrible things that do happen in the world at large, and where would we be without that sense of humour? So yes, it was a very important part of it for me too, that there was a lot of playfulness in amongst this darkness.
My Favourite Things already has a melody written for it, but you can easily imagine some of these other poems and songs and ballads having music to them, and indeed this having a different place in the world as a performance piece. Do you have any plans to take the material further in other ways?
I also think it could definitely be taken in a number of ways, and I feel very open to whatever that might be. I sometimes fantasize about it being made into a film or a theatre piece, and I hope that one day it will. I think it will, and I hope that it will continue to have a life of its own, and grow away from me and grow into something else.
PJ Harvey talking about her new book, Orlam, which is out now. It would be remarkable on a stage, I think.